Well, good morning. It's right at 9 o'clock, so it's time to begin our Bible class study this morning. Appreciate everybody tuning in on the live stream, and appreciate all the good comments and everything I've had up to this point, and appreciate your encouragement in this study. And I've enjoyed this study quite a bit so far, so it's been helpful for me as well. So we'll continue our study this morning of the Messianic prophecies of Jesus and their fulfillment. So before we get started, let's have a word of prayer this morning. Dear most kind, gracious Father in heaven, we're so grateful for this Lord's Day that you blessed us with, Father, for the opportunity we have to listen and virtually to this Bible study this morning, Father, and participate in an hour of Bible study this morning. And we're grateful for the technology that we have, Father. We can still continue to engage in Bible study time remotely, even though we can't assemble together as we would like, Father. And thankful for the assembly that we will have here shortly, Father. And pray for your blessings upon us as we assemble together here to worship you this morning. And pray for all those that are sick or hurting in different ways. Know that there's a lot of people that we're mindful of, Father, that need prayers on their behalf. Just pray for your blessings upon all those that we know of, Father, and especially those that might be dealing with the COVID at this time. And just pray for your blessings upon them, Father. And pray you help us as Christians to always do the things that we should, Father, and forgive us for the times that we've fallen short of your glory. Help us to always live according to your will. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. So again, a brief review of where we've been up to this point. Our lesson so far. We are currently on lesson, our point number 10 and 11. So this morning we'll cover 2 points, 2 prophecies concerning Jesus and their fulfillments. So I've read through these every week. I don't think there's necessarily any point of reading through the whole list every week, but this is a summary of where we've been up to this point in our study. Last week we studied the prophecy of the time of death in the book of Daniel that prophesied, the time that Jesus would die on the cross. That was a much more involved study than some of the points that we made at this point. Today we'll get a little bit of a break. It won't be as difficult of a study as it was last week, but it's still just as interesting and just as beneficial for us to study these prophecies as well. So we'll start this morning. Our first prophecy will be the massacre of infants. So we'll probably most of us will remember or know what we're referring to when we say the massacre of infants. This is when Jesus was a baby, and King Herod slaughtered all the male children around Bethlehem at this time in order to try to kill Jesus. So we'll look at this prophecy this morning. This will be our first prophecy. From Jeremiah chapter 31 and verse 15, this is our prophecy verse. It says, "Thus saith the Lord, a voice was heard in Ramah, lamentation and bitter weeping. Rachel, weeping for her children, refused to be comforted for her children, because they were not." So we shall see as we look closer that this verse applies to the massacre of the infants, but that it was originally, we say the context shows that this was geared toward the Jews. So we can apply this context to the massacre of infants that was performed at the order of Herod when Jesus was a baby. But we can see as we move on that this is actually the prophecy is initially talking about the Israelites. But we can see that the context shows great distress and weeping, and all that would obviously be associated with the loss of a child. So let's look at this verse in more detail. It says, "A voice was heard in Ramah." Ramah is Strong's H7414, which means hill. But Ramah is the name of several cities in the nation of Israel, most notably a town in Benjamin on the border of Ephraim. It's about 5 miles from Jerusalem. We also notice that it mentions Rachel. It says, "Rachel weeping for her children." So it's spelled a little bit differently. But if you look at, again, the Hebrew word there, that strong 7354, it means ewe, as in a ewe lamb. But it is referring to the daughter of Laban and the wife of Jacob and the mother of Joseph and Benjamin. So we'll remember Rachel as being Jacob's wife. We remember the story of the trials that he went through in order to take Rachel as his wife. So this is referring to Rachel as Jacob's wife. Obviously, at this point, Rachel has been dead for many years, so we know that she is being used in a figurative sense. Rachel's not here literally weeping, but we understand that she's being used in a figurative sense. So most likely, Rachel, being the wife of Jacob, is being used as a figurative mother for all of Israel. She's a figure of all the grieving mothers who have lost their children. So you think about Jacob, being the father of Israel, then we could look at Rachel as being a mother of Israel. So when we're talking about the death of the children in this verse, Rachel is used figuratively to represent all the grieving mothers at this time. It says, refused to be comforted for her children because they were not. This implies that the loss was so great and the pain was so hurtful that nothing and nobody could comfort the grieving mother. This is because the children were no longer alive. Obviously, the situation would certainly call for the lamentation and the bitter weeping that the context says here. So I think we could all understand how hurtful and how painful the grieving process would be for this grieving mother. So the overall context of Jeremiah chapter 31, verse 15, is referring to the carrying away of the Jews into Babylonian captivity. We don't have the time to examine that in detail this morning, but that is the context of Jeremiah chapter 31, verse 15. We know that Rachel was buried near Bethlehem. We have that recorded. She's depicted here in Jeremiah chapter 31 as wailing from the grave, per se, as a figurative mother of Israel, and the sound of her lamentations travels north beyond Jerusalem, and then is heard at Ramah, the city of Ramah, where the captives were actually collected as they were taken into captivity. So the picture that's being painted is that Rachel being, and I guess if we looked at a map, we could sort of see it, so we could see it a little bit more clearly. But Rachel being in the grave, a figurative mother of Israel, is around the city of Bethlehem. We know that Ramah is about 5 miles from Jerusalem. So the picture that's being painted is that the pain is so great and it's so hurtful for the loss of these children that Rachel is weeping from the grave, and her cries are so loud that they come from Bethlehem, from her grave, all the way past Jerusalem up to the city of Ramah, which is where the captives were collected to take into Babylonian captivity. So that's our prophecy verse. Again, these are the two we'll look at this morning. Will be a little bit more straightforward than some we've looked at, especially one last week. But this is our prophecy verse for the massacre of the infants. And it may not be abundantly clear right now how this applies to Jesus, but we'll get to that. So our prophecy is fulfilled in Matthew chapter 2, and specifically verse number 16. It says, Then Herod, when he saw he was mocked of the wise men, was exceeding wroth, and sent forth and slew all the children that were in Bethlehem, and in all the coasts thereof, from 2 years old and under, according to the time which he had diligently inquired of the wise men. Let me turn over to Matthew chapter 2. So that's our account of Herod actually ordering the slaughter and the massacre of the infants. So we can see this is the record for that, Matthew chapter 2. Let's turn back to, or start back in verse number 1, sort of get the overall picture here. I'm going to start at verse 1 of Matthew chapter 2 and read through verse number 8. Now when Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, there came wise men from the east to Jerusalem, saying, Where is he that is born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east, and are come to worship him. When Herod the king had heard these things, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And when he had gathered all the chief priests and scribes of the people together, he demanded of them where Christ should be born. And they said unto him, In Bethlehem of Judea, for thus is written by the prophet, And thou, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, art not the least among the princes of Judah, for out of thee shall come a governor that shall rule my people Israel. Then Herod, when he had privily called the wise men, inquired of them diligently what time the star appeared. And he sent him to Bethlehem and said, Go and search diligently for the young child, and when you have found him, bring me word again, that I may come and worship him also. So we can see the plan that Herod is laying out. It says he's troubled when he hears that there's a king of the Jews. So Herod is fearful that his reign and his kingdom is going to be threatened by another king. So he finds out from the wise men where Jesus is supposed to be born, and then conjures up this secret plan. Well, you go and find him, and then you come and tell me where he's at, so I can worship him as well. But we'll see as we move through the chapter that Herod's plan was actually to find where Jesus was and then have him killed. So skipping down to verse number 12, it says, And being warned of God in a dream that they should not return to Herod, they departed into their own country another way. And when they were departed, behold, the angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream, saying, Arise and take the young child and his mother, and flee into Egypt, and be thou there until I bring thee word, for Herod will seek the young child to destroy him. So Herod sought to kill Jesus because of fear of another ruler threatening his own rule. He inquired of the wise men of Jesus' location, and they were warned by God to not go back to Herod because of what Herod's actual plan was. So the wise men came to Jesus, departed another way, didn't go back to Herod and tell him. But we can see that this made Herod very, very angry. This is how we ended up with the massacre of the infants in Matthew chapter 2. So if you see this, Herod was expecting the wise men to come back and give him word. Well, they never came back and gave him word. So we see Matthew chapter, going back to verse number 16, Then Herod, when he saw that he was mocked of the wise men, was exceeding wroth, and sent forth and slew all the children that were in Bethlehem, and in all the coasts thereof, from 2 years old and under, according to the time which he had diligently inquired of the wise men. Then was fulfilled that which was spoken by Jeremiah the prophet, saying, In Ramah was there a voice heard, lamentation and weeping, and great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children, and will not be comforted because they are not. So Matthew makes reference to Jeremiah chapter 31 and 15 as a prophecy of the massacre of the infants. But if we remember, the context of Jeremiah chapter 31 was actually talking about the carrying away into the Babylonian captivity. So why would Matthew reference it here as being fulfilled? Well, I think we can see that in terms of biblical prophecy, there are typically three types of prophecies and fulfillments that we can usually see in the Bible. First, we see direct prophecies that would predict specific events. For example, in our study this far, we've looked at prophecies of Jesus being born in Bethlehem or descending from the tribe of Judah. These are direct prophecies predicting a specific event. We can see here, even in Matthew chapter 2, when Herod asks the chief priests and the scribes where Jesus is going to be born, they tell him that he's going to be born in Bethlehem, and they even quote the prophecy. So they knew that Jesus was going to be born in Bethlehem because they had the prophecy. So that's a direct prophecy for a specific event. Second, we have dual prophecies, or those of double reference. These prophecies have a primary fulfillment and a secondary fulfillment. In our lesson on Jesus as heir to the throne of David, we saw how Jesus could be said to be a type of David, or that David could be said to be a type of Christ. We saw that there was a symbolism between a physical David and a spiritual Jesus, especially related to the kingdom and the reigning, and of course Jesus on David's throne. There's a dual meaning there, a dual prophecy where we have, a physical meaning and a spiritual meaning, or maybe a physical fulfillment and a spiritual fulfillment. So there's that's the second type of prophecy, would be a dual prophecy or a double meaning, double reference. Third, we have indirect prophecies. So this would be when a direct prophecy can be said to be fulfilled indirectly by another event. We haven't covered any indirect prophecies in our study up to this point until now this morning. So the prophecy of the massacre of the infants can be said to be an indirect prophecy. And that's because, like we said, even though Jeremiah chapter 31 and verse 15 is referring to the time of the captivity, into the Babylonian captivity, Matthew here, by inspiration, saw the indirect fulfillment of this prophecy during Herod's massacre of the infants. So if you look at a comparison between the two, what's going on in Jeremiah chapter 31, well, you've got the kingdom of Israel being invaded, people being killed, people being carried away into captivity. It was obviously a very stressful time and hard time for the nation of Israel, and that it was a punishment, right? So it wasn't going to be easy. So there was some rough times for the nation of Israel. So the same could be said for those infants that had been massacred under Herod's reign. It would be a very tough time for the mothers and the family. And it would be a very similar situation as far as the massacre of these infants versus the large number of people killed and or carried away into the captivity. So we can see how the fulfillment fits the context. The figurative use of Rachel as a mourning mother of Israel, and the tremendous lamentation and bitter weeping fits here just as it does in Jeremiah. Especially since Rachel was buried at Bethlehem, and the massacre took place in Bethlehem and the surrounding area. So we can see how, again, Rachel being a figurative mother of Israel, she's buried at Bethlehem. This massacre takes place at Bethlehem. Her cries would figuratively come from the grave, go north all the way past Jerusalem into Ramah. So there's an indirect fulfillment of this prophecy that Matthew has given us, by inspiration of the Holy Spirit. So it's worth noting that the biblical account is the only record of the massacre of infants by King Herod. So due to that, some scholars have doubted that the event actually even happened. Unfortunately, there are those that today still doubt the historical authenticity of the Bible. Throughout history, there have been multiple times when modern history and or archaeology have been at odds with the Bible. And when those situations arise, typically those scholars and professors will claim that the Bible is wrong because they'll claim the Bible does not agree with history or with archaeology, so the Bible must be wrong. But we know that the Bible is right, and if science doesn't agree with the Bible, then your science is wrong, not the Bible. And we can see that all the way throughout history. Anytime science or archaeology or modern history has been at odds with the Bible always comes out on top. It's just a matter of time. So just a few examples of how this has happened in the past. Until the 20th century, it was believed that Moses could not have written the Old Testament law because written language was said to be virtually unknown or not common during this time. Modern archaeological discoveries, however, have shown that writing was in common use prior to the time of Moses. An ancient people known as the Hittites are mentioned some 50 times in the Old Testament. For a long time, they were considered to be fabricated by the Bible because the only evidence of their existence came from the Old Testament. Liberal scholars assume the biblical references to the Hittites were historically worthless. Archaeologist A.H. Sayce was the first scholar to identify the Hittite people from a non-biblical source. In 1876, he released his information from his study of the ancient monuments and revolutionized critical theories concerning the Hittites. In the 20th century, much more information about the Hittites came to light, confirming the historical accuracy of the Old Testament. the fact of their existence, or the fact of the existence of the Hittite people today, is beyond all doubt. The 5th chapter of the book of Daniel mentions a ruler named Belshazzar. For a long time, this reference was assumed to be a made-up name by the author of Daniel, who supposedly wrote hundreds of years after the alleged events took place. This, of course, would make the author of Daniel not the biblical Daniel, but some forger instead. However, discoveries in Babylon have shown that Belshazzar did indeed exist as ruler in the 5th century BC. Therefore, the author was historically accurate, and consequently, it gives us no reason to doubt that the author was exactly who he claimed to be, and that's Daniel the prophet. Also, critics said that the Israelites could not have entered Canaan when the Old Testament said they did, because the Ammonites did not live there during this time. In 1989, biblical archaeologists proved that the Ammonites were there long before the Israelites' exodus from Egypt. So this is just a few examples of how when science or history or archaeology goes against the Bible, in time the Bible was always proven to be right. So we have no reason to doubt that the situation with King Herod here is going to be any different. When those doubt, some scholars doubt that Herod actually committed this massacre of infants because the Bible is the only source of this information. We should have no doubt as Christians that it's still true, and that maybe one day science and history might actually catch up to the Bible with this information. Maybe it won't. Either way, the Bible is still right. But I think we can come up with at least a couple reasons of why this incident may not be recorded elsewhere. Why the only account is covered in the Bible. First, I think that it's probably doubtful that King Herod would want this event documented in the royal history. I mean, what king would document such a horrible action that he took? That he massacred a bunch of infants, a bunch of babies, 2 years and under. I don't think there would be any king, even if he committed such an act, would want that documented in his royal history. So I would imagine that King Herod didn't want that documented, so he didn't have it written down. And we could see, even today, how those, if you look at the media or those that control, anything, what's written in books, history books, or any of the information that goes out today is always controlled by those that are in power. And if that person has enough power, then they can specifically control exactly what information is printed about them. And obviously Herod would want to paint himself in a good light as much as possible, and probably not want to document that he had massacred a bunch of infants during this time. Also, we know that Bethlehem was a small city, so it could be possible that the number of infants murdered wasn't very large, or was relatively small. We know that any number of infants killed is a large number, but relatively speaking, it could have been a relatively low number based on the population of Bethlehem and the surrounding areas. Some scholars put it as low as 20. So it could be that since this was fixed to a very local area, Bethlehem and the surrounding area, and it was a relatively small number of infants, potentially involved, that the news didn't necessarily get out to other surrounding areas as heavily as some other events. That could be one reason as well. But regardless of why it's not, we understand that it's recorded for us in the Bible, and we know it to be true. So that's our study on the massacre of infants. We've got about 5 minutes or so left, so I'm kind of go into our next one, which is the flight into Egypt, which is right along the lines of the massacre of infants anyway. It's in the same context. So our second prophecy verse this morning comes from Hosea chapter 11 and verse 1. So we'll see that this prophecy and fulfillment fits the second type that we mentioned, which is the dual prophecy or the double reference. But Hosea 11 chapter 1 says, "When Israel was a child, then I loved him and called my son out of Egypt." So I think we can see from the context here of Hosea chapter 11, if we turn over to Hosea chapter 11, that this is also clearly referencing the children of Israel, the nation of Israel. Hosea chapter 11, we just read verse 1. It says that when Israel was a child, he was called out of Egypt. In Exodus chapter 4 and verse 22, Israel is mentioned as being God's son. And Exodus chapter 4 and verse 22 says, "And thou shalt say unto Pharaoh, Thus saith the Lord, Israel is my son, even my firstborn." So we know that the Israelite bondage and deliverance from Egypt was very early in the Jewish history. And so with Israel being depicted as a son, it could be said that Israel was a child at this time. So during the time of the Egyptian bondage, Israel could be said to be a child. And that's why in Hosea chapter 11 verse 1, when it says, when Israel was a child, then I loved him and called my son out of Egypt. Verse number 2 mentions Israel's sins and idolatry towards God. Verse number 2 says, as they called them, so they went from them. They sacrificed unto Balaam and burned incense to graven images. Verse number 5 mentions the Assyrian captivity imposed upon the nation of Israel during the divided kingdom. Verse number 5 says, He shall not return into the land of Egypt, but the Assyrian shall be his king, because they refused to return. And then verse number 12 mentions the kingdoms of the nation and their attitude towards God. Verse number 12 says, Ephraim compasseth me about with lies, and the house of Israel with deceit, but Judah yet ruleth with God, and is faithful with the saints. So we can see again from the context here, Hosea chapter 11, the primary prophecy is directed toward the nation of Israel. We see that with the context, the things that are mentioned explicitly concerning Israel's flight out of Egypt and their history with God and the captivity and those sort of things. The primary prophecy is related to the nation of Israel. However, we can see that there's a secondary prophecy that's related to Jesus. We see the secondary fulfillment of this prophecy as it relates to Jesus in Matthew chapter 2, which is the same context we were in as far as the massacre of the infants. But Matthew chapter 2, verse number 14 and 15 says, When he arose, well, let's start in verse number 13. And when they were departed, behold, the angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream, saying, Arise and take the young child and his mother, and flee into Egypt, and be thou there until I bring thee word, for Herod will seek the young child to destroy him. When he arose, he took the young child and his mother by night, and departed into Egypt, and was there until the death of Herod, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by the Lord by the prophet, saying, Out of Egypt have I called my son. So, we've already looked at the massacre of infants this morning, and we understand what was going on there. The angel comes to Joseph and tells him to take his family, take Mary and Jesus into Egypt. That's so that he could escape the grasp of Herod, because the Lord knew what Herod was about to do. Herod was going to try to kill Jesus. And so the plan was to get Jesus out of Herod's kingdom, out of Herod's rule, somewhere safe. And Egypt would have been a safe place for Jesus to stay. And he did so until King Herod died, and then he actually came back. But the objective was to get Jesus outside of Herod's grasp in order to keep Jesus safe during this time. So how does Jesus' flight into Egypt fulfill this prophecy? So I think the fulfillment comes when we see Israel as a type of Christ. So we've looked a lot at, or some here in our studies of types and antitypes. This morning we mentioned again David as a type of Christ. We've got a physical David and a spiritual Jesus. So again, we've got a type here of Israel Israel can be said to be a type of Christ. So let's look at some of the comparisons between Israel and Christ and how we can say that Israel could be a type of Christ. First, we see that Israel is called God's son, and that was in Exodus chapter 4 and verse 22. We just read when Moses was told before Pharaoh, And thou shalt say unto Pharaoh, Thus saith the Lord, Israel is my son, even my firstborn. And of course we know that Jesus is God's son, and there's many verses that would show that. John 3:16 obviously shows us that God gave His only begotten Son. So Israel could be said to be a type of Christ because they're both considered God's son. They were both called out of Egypt. We can see that both Israel and Jesus went to Egypt at the command of God, and then both were called out of Egypt at the command of God. So we can see a comparison there. They both went into and out of Egypt at the command of God. There's also a significance of the number 40 in between Israel and Jesus. We know that the spies were in Canaan for 40 days, and due to the rejection of the lack of faith of the kingdom of Israel at that time, they were punished, and they wandered 40 years in the wilderness. So there was a significance of the number 40 there. We also know that Jesus fasted for 40 days in the desert. So we could say the number 40 there is significant because we have a link between the wandering in the wilderness and the 40 days of fasting that Jesus did in the desert. So we could go on and devote, an entire lesson to Israel as a type of Christ if we really wanted to dig deep. But I think we can see the symbolism just in the things that we've mentioned here. So with this comparison, I think we can see that Jesus' flight into Egypt and then His return out of Egypt mirrors the Israelites' entrance into Egypt during Joseph's time, and then the Israelites' exodus out of Egypt at a later time. So we can see the dual prophecy, the dual application of the prophecy of Hosea chapter 11 and the dual fulfillment of both Israel and Jesus. But then again, the context even tells us here, in Matthew chapter 2, verse 15, that this was a fulfillment of this prophecy. Verse number 15, and was there until the death of Herod, that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken of the Lord by the prophet, saying, out of Egypt have I called my son. And that's a reference back to Hosea chapter 11, verse 1. So that's our study for this morning. Like I said, this study was a little bit more straightforward, a little bit easier potentially than our study last week. So it is nice to be able to dive in deep sometimes, and then also have some studies that are a little bit more straightforward. But they all point to the inspired nature of the Bible, the providence of God, that these prophecies were laid out so long ago, and then were fulfilled just as well many years later. So appreciate everybody that joined in this morning on the live stream, and look forward to seeing you here shortly during our worship service.